A decorated war veteran sat quietly outside Buckingham Palace, hands folded, medals gleaming, a memory heavier than words. In his lap rested a box. Inside, the military cross, a symbol of gallantry, of what was given, of who never came home. But when that medal slipped from his hands and fell to the stones in front of 1,000 tourists, no one stepped forward except one royal guard. He wasn't supposed to move, he wasn't supposed to speak. But what he did next stunned everyone, watching, because when tradition told him to stand still, his duty told him to act. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe some rules are worth bending to honor what matters, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with the bell turned on so you never miss a moment like this one. Let's get into it. It was one of those mornings that made London postcards look cheap by comparison. Clear blue sky stretched over Buckingham Palace like it had been iron smooth, not a cloud worth mentioning anywhere. The kind of May morning that had tourists checking their cameras twice, making sure they weren't missing this perfect light bouncing off those famous iron gates. By 10, the forecourt was buzzing with that pre-ceremony energy. Families clustered behind the rope barriers, kids bouncing on their toes, phones already out and recording nothing in particular. Everyone knew the changing of the guard was coming, and everyone wanted to catch it. Standing dead center in all this controlled chaos was Lance Sergeant Edward Trent, 33 years old. Coldstream Guards, scarlet tunic pressed so sharp you could cut paper with the creases, bearskin hat sitting tall and proud, rifle positioned with mathematical precision across his shoulder. To the crowd, he was basically a living statue. Red coat, blank face, completely still except for that slow, measured march every few minutes. Children pointed at him with sticky fingers. Parents whispered questions about whether he was allowed to blink. But Edward wasn't a statue. Inside that perfectly pressed uniform was a man who'd done 2 tours in Helmand Province, a man who still carried a piece of Afghan shrapnel in his left thigh. Still woke up some nights hearing mortar that weren't there. He'd seen roadside bombs turn armored vehicles into scrap metal, had carried wounded mates through gunfire, had written letters to families back home explaining why their sons weren't coming back. He'd requested ceremonial duty after his second deployment, not because he was done fighting, but because he needed something steady, something that made sense. The chaos of combat had left him craving order, routine, predictability. The palace offered all three. Abundance. The drill was simple enough: 21 steps forward, turn, pause for 21 seconds, turn again, repeat until your shift ended. Hour after hour, day after day, precise as clockwork. The tourists loved it, the photographers ate it up, and Edward, when found a strange peace in the rhythm. No variables, no split-second decisions, no one depending on him to bring them home alive. His boots clicked against the stone with metronomic precision. He'd been doing this for 18 months now, and he could march these 21 steps in his sleep, which was useful because sometimes he did. The crowd shifted and murmured around him, but Edward had learned to tune it out. Flash cameras, guidebooks rustling, parents explaining to kids why the guard couldn't smile back at them. It was all just background noise, now part of the job, but his mind never really switched off. Couldn't after Helmand. Even here, surrounded by tourists and ceremony, some part of him stayed alert, watching, calculating. Old habits from a place where letting your guard down got people killed. He was halfway through another turn when he noticed the wheelchair. Nothing dramatic about it, just an old man in a navy blazer getting positioned near the rope line by a woman who was probably his daughter. Happened all the time. Veterans came to see the ceremony, brought their families, took pictures. Normal stuff. The palace was a pilgrimage site for military families, a place to remember service and sacrifice. Except something about this one felt different. Edward completed his turn, started the next 21 steps. As he marched, his peripheral vision caught more details. The man wasn't taking pictures, wasn't smiling for the camera his daughter kept trying to hand him. He was just sitting there, staring at Edward with an intensity that felt familiar, the kind of stare you got from someone who'd worn the uniform, who understood what it meant to stand post, to carry the weight of tradition and responsibility. The man's hands rested on something in his lap, small, dark blue, square. Edward couldn't see what it was from this distance, but the way the old man held it suggested it mattered a lot. His fingers kept adjusting their grip, protective, careful, like he was holding something fragile, something precious. Captain Alan Whitaker had been planning this trip for months, though he'd never told Ruth the real reason. She thought he was coming to London for the sights, maybe some shopping, definitely to get out of the house for a change. She worried about him being isolated since her mother died, spending too much time alone with his memories and his regrets. She had no idea her father had been carrying that small navy box in his jacket pocket every day for the past 6 weeks, working up the courage to bring it here, taking it out sometimes when he was alone, opening it, looking at what was inside, then closing it again without touching anything. The military cross had been gathering dust in his bedroom drawer for 39 years, not because he didn't value it, but because every time he looked at it, he saw Keith Ramsden's face. 19 years old, ginger hair, Terrible jokes about Yorkshire tea and Welsh sheep. Dead before his 20th birthday because Alan hadn't been fast enough to pull him clear of that explosion. The Falklands had been a different kind of war. Wet, brutal. Alan had been a young captain then, responsible for 32 men on a godforsaken hillside. When the Argentinians started shelling their position, he'd done what officers do, made decisions. Gave orders, tried to keep his boys alive. He'd saved 3 of them that day, dragged wounded soldiers to cover under heavy fire, organized a fighting withdrawal, called in air support. They'd given him the military cross for it, called him a hero, but Keith was the one who deserved it. Keith was the one who'd thrown himself forward without thinking, trying to disarm an IED that should have been left for the engineers, trying to save everyone else the way 19-year-olds do when they think they're immortal. The explosion had killed him instantly, but his body had shielded Alan from the worst of the blast. Alan had never worn the medal, couldn't bear to, but he'd carried it with him every Remembrance Day, every anniversary, every time the guilt got too heavy to manage alone. Today, finally, he wanted to do something with it. Something that felt like honoring Keith instead of just remembering how he'd failed him. He wasn't sure what, exactly. Maybe just hold it while watching the guards march. Maybe say a quiet prayer. Maybe finally let himself feel proud instead of guilty. The palace seemed like the right place for it, where tradition lived, where sacrifice was remembered, where young soldiers still stood guard over things that mattered. Ruth was distracted, answering a work call on her phone, stepping back a few feet to hear better over the crowd noise. Something about a client meeting, a deadline, the endless urgency of business that never quite seemed to understand that some things were more important than profit margins. Alan looked around, made sure no one was paying attention to an old man in a wheelchair, and carefully opened the blue box. The military cross sat there like it always did, silver, pristine, the purple and white ribbon coiled neatly beside it. He'd polished it just last week, like he did every year on the anniversary, not because he planned to display it, but because it felt wrong to let Keith's sacrifice tarnish. The inscription was still crisp for gallantry, 2 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. Alan reached for it with fingers that weren't as steady as they used to be. Arthritis mostly, but also nerves. 40 years of carrying this. He still wasn't sure he deserved to touch it. The metal felt different in his hands than it did behind glass, warmer, heavier, more real. His left hand closed around the metal, lifted it carefully from its velvet nest. The metal was cold despite the morning sun, heavier than he remembered. For just a moment, holding it felt right, like Keith was there with him, finally getting the recognition he'd earned. Like maybe, after all these years, Alan could stop feeling guilty for surviving. Then his grip slipped. Maybe it was the arthritis. Maybe the emotion. Maybe just 40 years of guilt making his hand shake at the worst possible moment. But the military cross tumbled from his fingers, bounced off the armrest of his wheelchair, and skittered across the stone pavement. It landed with a sound like a slapshot. Final, wrong. The kind of noise that cut through conversations and made people turn their heads. Right in the middle of the ceremonial area, just past the rope line where tourists weren't supposed to go. Alan stared at it, frozen. The metal lay there, catching sunlight, purple ribbon trailing behind it like a tiny flag of surrender, close enough to see clearly, close enough to read the inscription if he squinted, but too far to reach without leaving his wheelchair. And even if he could reach it, his knees weren't going to let him kneel down on palace stones, not anymore. A teenager in a Manchester United shirt noticed first. "Oi, that bloke dropped something." He pointed, not bothering to lower his voice. His accent was broad Mancunian, the kind that turned simple observations into pronouncements. "Looks like some kind of badge." His mate squinted at it, chewing gum with his mouth open. "Probably fake. You can buy those in the gift shop for a tenner. My granddad's got loads of them." They both laughed, and Alan felt something crack in his chest. Not physical pain, but something deeper, the sound of Keith's sacrifice being dismissed by kids who thought courage was something you bought in a shop with a credit card. Ruth turned around, saw her father's expression, immediately knew something was wrong. She'd seen that look before, the same expression he'd worn at her mother's funeral, when the flag had slipped from the coffin during the honor guard ceremony. Pure, helpless grief. "Dad, what happened?" But Alan couldn't answer. He was staring at Keith's medal, lying on the ground like rubbish, being dismissed by strangers who had no idea what it meant, what it cost, who had died for it. A few other people noticed. An American woman in a Yankees cap whispered to her husband, someone should help him. A French tourist started to move forward, then stopped when his wife grabbed his arm and shook her head. Palace protocol was clear, even to tourists who don't cross into the ceremonial area. You don't interfere with the guards. You stay behind the barrier and watch. An elderly man with a walking stick leaned heavily on his companion's arm, squinting at the medal. "That's a military cross," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew. "That's not fancy dress. That's the real thing." But still, no one moved. The military cross glinted in the sun, ignored by hundreds of people who had no idea they were looking at a piece of someone's soul. Edward Trent saw it on his next turn, saw the medal, saw the old man's face. saw the exact moment when dignity crumbled into despair. His trained eye took in every detail in a split second. Silver cross, military ribbon, veteran in distress. The math was simple enough. He'd seen enough medals in his time to recognize quality. This wasn't some tourist souvenir. The proportions were right. The craftsmanship, genuine. The way it caught the light, distinctly military. Someone had earned this. Someone had bled for it, but the solution wasn't simple at all. Guards don't break formation. Guards don't respond to crowd incidents. Guards don't speak, don't flinch, don't acknowledge anything beyond their prescribed duty. The rules weren't suggestions. They were written in stone, enforced by centuries of tradition, backed by disciplinary action that could end careers and ruin lives. Edward had seen it happen. A guard at Windsor who'd fainted during a summer ceremony, reprimanded for failure to maintain bearing. Another who'd helped a lost child transferred to a remote posting in Scotland, where cameras couldn't find him. The tradition was bigger than any individual, more important than personal feelings. Edward completed his 21 steps, turned and stood at attention. The medal was maybe 10 feet away now, close enough to read the inscription if he wanted to, close enough to step over and pick up in about 3 seconds, close enough to ruin everything he'd worked for. He thought about Corporal Jaime Watts again. Jaime, who'd earned his military cross posthumously after jumping on a grenade to save the squad. Edward had been the one to carry Jaime's body home, had stood with Jaime's mum when they handed her that medal at the ceremony, the way she'd held it like it weighed 1,000 pounds, like it contained everything good about her son, compressed into 2 ounces of silver. That's what medals like this were. They weren't decorations, they weren't symbols. They were anchors, pieces of someone's soul that got left behind when they didn't make it home. Physical reminders that courage was real, that sacrifice mattered, that some things were worth dying for. Edward started his next march 21 steps, same as always, but with each step he could feel the weight of that medal pulling at him, could feel the old man's shame radiating across the courtyard, like heat waves off summer pavement. Step 15, 16, 17. The crowd was starting to lose interest. A few people had taken pictures of the medal on the ground, but most had moved on. Tourists had short attention spans. There were other things to see, other photo opportunities. The ceremony would start soon, and that's what they'd really come for. But the old man hadn't moved, still sat there, staring at the medal like it was the last piece of someone he'd loved. His daughter was trying to talk to him, offering to call security, suggesting they just leave and come back. Another day he wasn't listening. Step 20, 20-1. Edward stopped, turned, and for the first time in 18 months of ceremonial duty, he hesitated. Not obviously. Not in a way that would show up on tourist cameras or register with his fellow guards. But for just a fraction of a second, he stood there weighing duty against conscience, protocol against humanity, the letter of his orders against the spirit of why those orders existed in the first place. The medal caught the light again, purple ribbon fluttering slightly in the breeze. The old man sat like stone, staring at it with eyes that held 40 years of regret. And Edward Trent made a decision that would either end his career or define it. He stepped off the line. The change was immediate. Conversations stopped mid. Camera phones snapped up like birds taking flight. A child's voice cut through the sudden quiet. "Mummy, why is he moving?" Edward walked with purpose, each step deliberate and measured, not hurried, not hesitant, just a soldier moving to complete a mission. His boots rang against the stone, the only sound in a courtyard that had gone completely silent. Even the traffic noise from the mall seemed muted, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Behind him, he could hear another guard's quick intake of breath. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's not supposed to do that." He reached the medal, stopped and knelt down. The entire forecourt held its breath. Edward picked up the military cross with the same precision he used for everything else. No theatrics, no unnecessary drama, just a white-gloved hand lifting a piece of history from the ground where it didn't belong. Up close, he could see the fine details of the craftsmanship, the weight of real silver, the way genuine ribbon felt different from the synthetic stuff they used for dress uniforms. This was the real thing, earned in blood, carried in love, lost in grief. He stood, turned, and walked to the rope line where Alan Whitaker sat frozen in his wheelchair. "Sir," Edward said, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry to the people nearby. The words felt strange in his mouth after months of ceremonial silence. "I believe this belongs with you." He held out the medal. Alan's hand trembled as he reached for it, fingers brushing against Edward's glove as he took it back. The touch was brief, but electric. For just a moment, they were both holding it, veteran and active duty, past and present, to men who understood what that piece of silver really represented. "Thank you," Alan whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite control. "This was my friend's, Keith Ramsden. He died saving others." Edward nodded once, sharp and precise. "No need to thank me, sir, just doing my job." But his eyes said something different. They said, "I understand. I've been there. I know what it costs." He turned and walked back to his post, resumed his position, checked his bearing, adjusted his rifle. and began the next phase of his march as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The courtyard stayed quiet for another few seconds. Tourists processing what they'd just witnessed. Then someone started clapping. Slowly at first, just one person near the back, then another. Soon, half the crowd was applauding and the other half was busy posting videos to social media with captions like "amazing" and "this is why I love Britain" and "Royal Guard breaks protocol to help veteran." Ruth moved to her father's side, crouched down beside his wheelchair. "Dad, you okay?" Alan looked down at the medal in his hands, then back at the guard who'd returned it. Edward was already moving through his routine, face blank, posture perfect, as if the last few minutes had been part of the ceremony all along. He understood, Alan said quietly. He knew what this was. Ruth squeezed his shoulder. "Are you ready to go home?" Alan closed his fingers around the military cross, felt its familiar weight settling into his palm. For the first time in 40 years, it didn't feel like guilt. It felt like what it was supposed to be, a reminder of courage. Keith's courage, the guard's courage, maybe even his own. "Yeah," he said, settling back in his wheelchair, "I think I'm ready." As they made their way back through the crowd, Alan kept the medal in his hand instead of putting it back in the box. People noticed, smiled, nodded respectfully. A few veterans in the crowd recognized it for what it was, gave him small salutes as he passed. An old man with a Royal Navy tie touched his cap. In acknowledgement, a woman with a Help for Heroes badge smiled and mouthed, "Thank you, Edward." Trent continued his march. 21 steps forward. Turn, 21 seconds, pause. Turn again. The same routine he'd performed thousands of times before, but this time felt different. This time felt right. The weight of his rifle seemed lighter somehow. The morning air cleaner. The stone beneath his feet more solid. He'd probably catch hell for it later, breaking protocol, abandoning post, engaging with civilians. The disciplinary report would make interesting reading. But as he marched past the spot where the medal had fallen, Edward found he didn't care about the consequences. Some things were more important than rules. Some moments demanded that you step forward even when stepping forward meant risking everything you'd worked for. Today had been one of those moments, and Edward Trent had no regrets. Later that evening, after the ceremonies were done and the tourists had gone home, Edward sat in the guard's mess with a cup of tea and waited for the inevitable summons from his commanding officer. The story was already spreading. Videos going viral on social media, news outlets picking up the footage. His phone had been buzzing with messages from mates in other units, family members who'd seen it on the news, strangers who'd found his details somehow and wanted to thank him. The mess was quieter than usual. Word had gotten around about what happened, and the other guards weren't quite sure how to react. Some looked at him with something like admiration. Others seemed worried about the precedent it might set. Most just carried on with their business, but the conversations were a bit more subdued than normal. "Bit of excitement today," commented Sergeant Mills, saddling into the chair across from him. Mills was old school, 23 years in the Guards. The kind of man who ironed his newspapers and polished his shoes before breakfast. "Bit," Edward agreed. "Worth it," Edward thought. About the old man's face when he'd handed back the medal, the relief, the gratitude, the quiet dignity restored. He thought about Jaime Watts, about Keith Ramsden, about all the soldiers who'd earned medals they never lived to receive. "Yep," he said, "definitely worth it." Mills nodded slowly, stirring his tea with more attention than it required. "Good on you, mate. Sometimes the right thing isn't the regulation thing that what you think. That's what I know. Been in long enough to see the difference between rules that matter and rules that just exist because they always have." The next morning brought a formal inquiry, as expected. Edward stood at attention in his commanding officer's office, prepared for whatever disciplinary action awaited him. Colonel Harrison sat behind his desk, Edward's service record open in front of him. The colonel was a lean man with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing. He'd served in Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan, the kind of officer who led from the front and never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. "Sergeant Trent," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Yesterday's incident has generated considerable attention." "Yes, sir. Care to explain your actions?" Edward kept his eyes fixed on the wall behind the colonel's head, where a painting showed the Battle of Waterloo in all its chaotic glory. "I observed a veteran in distress, sir. His military cross had fallen into the ceremonial area. I judged that retrieving it was consistent with our duty to honor military service. You broke formation, abandoned your post, engaged with civilians." "Yes, sir." The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers in front of him. Edward could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the distant sound of drill practice from the parade ground, his own heart beating steadily in his chest. "The palace has received over 300 letters since yesterday," Colonel Harrison said finally, "every one of them commending your actions. The press is calling you a hero." Edward said nothing. "They're also calling for you to receive a commendation. The video has been viewed over 2 million times. The Prime Minister's office rang this morning to express their support." "Still nothing. Your thoughts?" "Sergeant, I was doing my job, sir, nothing more." Colonel Harrison closed the file and looked up at Edward for the first time. Your job is to follow orders and maintain discipline. My job is to serve, sir. Sometimes that means more than just standing still. The colonel studied him for another moment, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Official reprimand for breaking protocol, he said, sliding the paper across the desk. Goes in your permanent file. Edward nodded unsurprised. Along with this, the colonel produced a second document, commendation for exceptional judgment and compassion in the execution of duty. Edward blinked, caught off guard. The Queen herself reviewed the footage. Colonel Harrison continued. Her exact words were, "That's what we want our guards to be, soldiers first, statues second." For the first time in the conversation, Edward allowed himself to smile. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You're being transferred to training duty. Apparently they want you to teach other guards how to think on their feet. Sir, you're going to help train the next generation of ceremonial guards. Make sure they understand that tradition and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. That sometimes the highest honor we can show the uniform is knowing when to step out of it." Edward stood straighter. "I'd be honored, sir. Good report to Sergeant Major Thompson on Monday and Trent, sir. Next time you decide to rewrite protocol, give me a heads up first." "Will do, sir." 3 months later, Alan Whitaker returned to Buckingham Palace. This time, he wasn't carrying the military cross in a hidden box. It was pinned to his blazer, right where it belonged. Gleaming in the afternoon sun, alongside his other campaign medals, the purple and white ribbon stood out against the navy. Will, catching the light every time he moved, Ruth pushed his wheelchair up to the rope line, where a small crowd of tourists was watching the guards perform their duties. The same ceremony, the same precision, the same red coats and tall hats. But Alan was looking for someone specific. He found him near the center of the formation, of a tall guard with perfect posture and an unreadable expression, marching with clockwork precision. But when the guard completed his turn and briefly faced their direction, Alan caught a glimpse of recognition in his eyes. Edward Trent was back on ceremonial duty, but with new responsibilities. He was training the younger guards now, teaching them that their job was about more than just standing still and looking impressive, teaching them to pay attention, to recognize when duty meant stepping forward instead of staying in line. He saw Alan immediately, noticed the medal pinned to his blazer, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. The old man looked different, straighter, somehow, more at peace. The weight he'd carried for decades seemed lighter now. Shared their eyes met across the courtyard for just a moment. No words needed, no gestures required, just two soldiers who understood what service really meant. Alan raised his hand slightly, a small wave that could have been mistaken for adjusting his jacket. Edward's response was even more subtle, the barest nod as he completed his turn. Then the ceremony continued, tradition flowing forward like it had for centuries, carrying with it the understanding that some things never changed, while others changed everything. Have you ever seen someone quietly break the rules for the right reasons? Tell us about it in the comments below. If this story reminded you that honor comes in many forms, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove heroes don't always make headlines. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with compassion. Check out our other Royal Guard stories for more moments when duty and humanity converged in ways no one expected. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another story that shows why these guards are so much more than ceremonial statues. They're protectors, teachers, and sometimes exactly what someone needs when hope seems lost.